It was in this brokenhearted season, though, where I grasped what that meant, that the Lord had always been near, but when we're brokenhearted, we're so desperate that nothing else will satisfy us. And so in those periods of time, not only are we so much more desperate in our seeking, but I think our hearts are so much more attuned to how near he really is. And I heard him speak to me in that season clearer than I've ever heard him spoke before or after. That season was the birthing of something very, very deep that I had never known was possible.
Welcome to Mom's Grab Coffee, where you'll be filled with wisdom, faith, and hope through real testimonies from moms of how God works in our lives. I'm your host, Hannah Lapsansky, and I invite you to pull up a chair, grab a cup of coffee, and get ready, my friend. We're about to speak the truth. Hey, my sweet mama friend, thanks so much for taking the time to tune in. I have got a great episode for you today. Michelle Donnelly, podcast host of the Christian Single Moms podcast and the founder of +oneparents.org, is here with me to talk about how we go about truly understanding what is driving our overwhelm, especially when it gets to a point where it feels really paralyzing to our life. She's going to dig into the thing beneath the thing and how she figured out what that deeper thing was when she was at a point in her life where her overwhelm felt crippling. So she'll talk about the ways she got out of that place and how we can do so as well, whether our overwhelm really feels crippling or it's just the daily grind of our routines. She's also going to talk about how we rest in God and find time to be with Him when our days feel so incredibly busy and exhausting. I know we're all there. I feel that on a daily basis. I have such a desire to connect with God, but sometimes it just feels like I can't find the time. So she's going to give us some strategies there. So my friend, get ready to be filled with faith, wisdom, and hope. It is my pleasure to welcome Michelle Donnelly and her story. Well, Michelle, thank you so much for joining Mom's Grab Coffee. I am so happy to have you on, and I can't wait to hear your story because we're going to talk about overwhelm, and there are different levels of overwhelm, right? The daily grind of just motherhood. Maybe it's, just the changing diapers, dealing with tantrums, that kind of thing, to really levels of overwhelm that can be debilitating and really feel like it's paralyzing your life. So you've gone through lots of different life events that have brought you to really high levels of overwhelm. So I want to talk through that and talk through some of your survival strategies, as well as how God has come in to really be true to who He is and help you through those moments. And you also have lots of resources. You have an amazing podcast, as well as an organization that helps single moms in particular. So we'll definitely talk about that. But before we go there, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I am a single mom of 3 kids, and we range in the house from teenager to toddler. Well, not so much toddler anymore. She's a preschooler now. But all, different variety of experiences that go with raising kids, with this great of an age span, girls and boys. And so, just also going through life leading a ministry, as you mentioned, that is devoted to single parents. And as you mentioned, this experience of overwhelm that, yes, it is the day-to-day, the day in, day out, which when you're a single parent just looks a little bit different. But I am aware as well, of how that experience of motherhood just touches these other woundings, these other places in our lives where we just feel like we're carrying a backpack full of bricks because our own motherhood, whether you're a single mom or not, can draw up these difficult experiences that maybe you've had to walk through, whether it was in your family of origin or things that have gone on in your own marriage or just whatever other life events may have gone on, that the overwhelm of motherhood just can be so triggering for those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it can come out of nowhere sometimes. Just the other night,
Yes.
I kind of felt like I was having an anxiety attack, and I don't know why, but it just came out of nowhere. Right before I went to bed, I was having all these thoughts like, oh my gosh, my kids are growing up too fast, and I didn't spend enough time with them. And then I'm thinking about my own childhood, and oh my gosh, my parents are getting old. And it's just, yeah, you start to feel overwhelmed really quickly sometimes.
Yeah, and a lot of times it comes out of nowhere, as you said, and over something that it doesn't make sense. I always say it's the
Yep.
thing beneath the thing. So I wrote a
Yeah.
blog post once about flipping out on my mom over not having broccoli at dinner.
Yep.
They used to have us over for Sunday dinners when the kids were really little. And they still do, but they'd have us over for dinner, and she'd cook something like grilled chicken or have pizza or something like that. And I was at the time just so grasping for a sense of stability, but that came out through control. And so it was this moment where I freaked out. Like, my mom had this beautiful spread, but yet I could only see, like, there's not a vegetable present here. And we joke about it to this day, but I've healed through it all. And now we know where that all came from. But at the moment, it was like, that happens and it feels like that is the most important thing. And then you step away from it and go, oh, it wasn't. What really was that all about?
Yeah. Yeah. I got to tell you, I've been in that exact situation, except with my husband, where he's in charge for dinner. And I'm like, oh, can you just throw a couple carrots on the plate? And you're right. There's something else going on underneath, but that was the trigger point. So let's get into your testimony here. Tell us about the series of events that brought you to that level of overwhelm that felt paralyzing to your life.
Yeah. So it's interesting where I start this story, or I'd say even where the Lord made me aware of this part of my story, because there was definitely a whole lot of overwhelm that was going on during my marriage. It was a very unhealthy situation. And yet at that time, I was so much in survival mode that I didn't even have the ability to comprehend everything that I was really carrying around. And so it wasn't until actually about 2 years after my divorce where I had back-to-back encounters with a couple of men that I had just been spending some time with, but they were mirror images. And while these encounters were more positive than my marriage, for example, they were still not the healthiest of situations for me to be in. And so I had to step back from that and go, all right, I could say, this is these people, or I could recognize that there's something going on with me that I keep heading in this direction. And so in that time frame, though, too, quarantine happened, lockdown happened for COVID. This was all in 2020. At that moment, the overwhelm became so paralyzing because here I was in my house. We'd just moved, so I still was unpacking my house with my 3 kids 24/7, me being responsible for every meal, every washing of everything. Then, all the frightfulness of what was going on around us, as we didn't really know what was going to happen as this pandemic unfolded. And so as that all, came to a head, that was where I really became so aware of the overwhelm, because all of my typical coping strategies were gone. So coping in the past for me had looked like lots of people pleasing, being very social, filling my calendar, filling my kids' calendars, being involved everywhere that I could think of, and just constantly pouring. And that was the way that I was able to distract myself, though, from the heft of what I really was running away from. And so in lockdown, all of that was gone. And just the paralysis is the right word. It was just so crushingly overwhelming, this sense of anxiety that I was having. And I knew, though, it was not because of the circumstances, I knew it had a greater connection to just the series of things that I had gone through in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that time of isolation, though, I had plenty of room to process. There were just very tearful but intentional sessions of time that I would spend with the Lord, before my kids got up, when they went to bed, where I could just let the questions come out. I could really ask him, where does all this come from? Why do I keep running into situations that are disappointing and hurtful? Why do I feel this crushing weight on my, just on my chest, but throughout my whole being? And the beautiful thing is when we get honest with God and we ask him what it is, he doesn't want us to be in the dark. He will tell you. And so in that period of time, he started to connect the dots for me. And some of this was through other books that I was reading also at the time about, trauma recovery and things like that. But it was in the previous 2 years since the divorce, it was, here are all the things that led you through this, to and through this relationship. But here are all the things so in this season, it was, here are all the things before that. Here are all the things from the way you were raised and your childhood and being bullied and church hurt and, feeling missed and misunderstood and, just all the things that I had walked through that up until that point I had normalized. I had just said, everybody has it rough. Everybody has a tough time at school, or, everybody has things that the way they were raised that, parents passed on with the best of intentions, but, like I don't have anything to complain about.
Yeah.
That was where I had buried it all. And God helped me to see, though, where I had just accepted it and moved forward, that I never really dealt with it. I never allowed 3-year-old Michelle, 6-year-old Michelle, 11-year-old Michelle, 13-year-old Michelle to grieve being treated in those ways.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the time period of grief. I had nowhere else to go and nothing else to do.
Right.
And so, it was hard on all of us, right? But for me, it was the Lord and his kindness, like sequestering me to the point where I could not escape it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And but him just bringing so much light and freedom into that space.
And did you speak to God or connect with him in a different way during that time than you had before?
Yeah, I think, if I think about my relationship with God when I was younger, I really was performing for him. I wanted him to be pleased with me. And I was trying to check all the boxes and do all the right things so that I could feel approved of. Some of that broke open through the divorce, where I started to really seek him and ask questions of him and get to know who he really was, not who I had been told he was.
So having like a personal relationship.
Yeah. And he'd been stepping me towards that probably, certainly my whole life, but he'd been stepping me really intentionally for that in the 10 years prior, but little bit by bit by bit. And this was just I was catapulted,
Yeah.
And so in this season, it was the most, the Psalm 30, I'm going to mess it up. I'm like, hang on, I always forget the address. The Psalm, it's where it says the Lord is near to the brokenhearted and he saves the crushed in spirit.
Yeah.
It was in this brokenhearted season, though, where I grasped what that meant, that the Lord had always been near, but when we're brokenhearted, we're so desperate that nothing else will satisfy us.
Yeah.
And so in those periods of time, not only are we so much more desperate in our seeking, but I think our hearts are so much more attuned to how near he really is. And I heard him speak to me in that season clearer than I've ever heard him spoke before or after. And though I do have a very deep and intimate relationship with the Lord now, that season was the birthing of something very, very deep that I had never known was possible.
And I like the fact that you were asking him questions. It's something that I've heard a lot of my guests say when they're at that breaking point, or when they simply want to know if God is real or not. They're asking him questions. Even those who have known about God their entire lives, suddenly they're asking questions that they've never asked him before. And that's where they found him to be true and to really speak to them as well. Speaking of, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I want to dig a little more into God speaking to you, because I think that can feel very complex. Like, what does that mean? What does that even feel like? So what was that like for you?
Yeah, this was interesting too, because in the period of time where my divorce was happening, the Lord moved me into a community that I probably would have never chosen for myself. And growing up, I would say that I had a sense many times that God was pointing something out to me or was speaking something to my heart, but there were not really people around me who could help me explore that or grow in that. Mm-hmm. And this community was the first place where I met other believers who not only affirmed that, but could help me to seek that further. So it was this sense that, if you do have this whisper to your heart or some word of wisdom that you receive, that there's no other reason why you would think that way, or it just sort of, it jars your awareness in a way that you just know is not you. I'm like, I am not that smart. I am not that capable. It's when your breath is taken away by those things. It was this community that was able to help me say, listen to that, press into that, and that the Lord, though, will confirm himself as well, that when he's speaking to you, it's going to line up with scripture. And the more that you're in scripture, the more you're going to know the shepherd's voice. Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, and my sheep know my voice. So understanding, though, that as we are combining these things with, our prayers and our experiences in our relational time with the Lord, and our study time with the Lord, and our time in community where we experience the Lord, that the more we immerse ourselves in that, the easier it is to peel away the doubt and to recognize that this is my good shepherd speaking to me and leading me in the way to go.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. So when you feel overwhelmed today, what's the first thing you start doing?
So I mentioned some of my strategies in the past were all about striving and performing and all those things. So God has taught me, since, all of that was broken open, what it is to rest and to seek refuge. And that's where, as you were talking about questions, it's where we are going to be racked in our mind and our emotions as long as we're carrying it and trying to figure it out on our own. And the Psalms show us that questioning God is a natural part of the relationship. You think about our kids, they ask us questions relentlessly,
Indeed.
But it's because they trust us. They want us to give them some context, some awareness, some reassurance, and so God is the same way. I think it's so beautiful how much we learn more about the Father's heart because we have kids, but we need to put ourselves in the kid's seat sometimes. But so always, rather than rushing off to call a friend or, just trying to push it out and get back to work and do something, to busy myself, it's to sit intentionally, quietly, and just tell God how I feel, and I think for many of us, especially if you grew up in some kind of legalistic sort of tradition, there's this sense of like, oh, you can't say those things to God. And he already knows how we feel. He's not caught off guard by any of these things, We're the only ones who are being deceived when we're trying to hide ourselves, hide ourselves from him. And so if we will do, what Adam and Eve did not do, they hid, so if we will expose our hearts, he is so kind and so gentle to meet us right where we're at and give us precisely what we need for that overwhelming moment, that we don't have to perform or figure it out, that we can just go to him and rest, and he will tenderly address every need that we are carrying in our souls.
Yes. I love that. Now, practically speaking, resting, exposing our hearts, even finding time to be with God. How do you do that with 3 kids?
Yeah. This has changed. So that's the first thing I want to say to somebody who's listening right now. It did not always look this way. There were times I was horribly inconsistent.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, I have a 4-year-old.
Yeah.
And this
So do
has
I.
all transpired in her lifetime. So the regular rhythm I have now has only been in its current iteration, for a shorter period of time than the rest.
Mm-hmm.
But what I will say is there's great value if you're able to waking up early in the morning before everyone else is awake, before everyone else is stirring, and have that beautiful cup of coffee with God.
Yes.
Crack open the word, even if you're finding something short to read, if you start in the Psalms, or just a chapter, something, and just ask God to point out something that he wants you to see today. And don't worry if you don't receive it in that moment, but expect that at some point later in the day, or maybe even later in the week, he's going to show up. He wants you to know where he is. And so that's a great practice for me, just to still my heart as I start my day and get filled up so I have something to pour into my kids. But then all throughout the day, I'm just looking for these things that bring delight, that I know God has placed there for me to enjoy, and if it's small things. If you have a favorite flower, if you have a favorite bird, if you have a favorite song, like when you hear those things or you see those things, that's God so tangibly in your day-to-day saying, "Hey, daughter, I see you." And so when you absorb those in that way, instead of just going, and passing through the day and not even noticing them, I call them God winks. There's just those moments that that he's smiling on you and he delights in you.
Yeah. And that you're making that connection too, right? So it's not just a bird, but it's a bird that speaks to you in a way.
Yeah. Well, and it's just, he's put desires in our hearts. He's put interests in our hearts. He's put abilities in our hearts. All these things, they're not just happenstance. They're ways that we get to encounter him uniquely in our day to day.
Yes.
And, so often we just kind of pass through our days and don't even take note of these things. But, part of being overwhelmed is feeling like you can't catch your breath, or like nobody really sees you. And to think of the God of the universe, we know he loves us, right? Like collectively,
right,
but individually, we may know that, but to experience that as delight, that he likes you, he loves you, but he likes you,
Exactly.
Like that's how you see, that's how you see those things throughout your day. And it the stuff is going to keep happening. You're still going to have the diapers and the homework and the, this, that, and the other, but they pale then in comparison to just getting to experience the love of God as you're walking through your day.
Yeah, Michelle, I love your heart for God, and I could just feel your joy. Before we get to more of the practical parts of how we understand our overwhelm and that kind of thing, I'd love for you to take a moment to tell us what you've learned about God, because it sounds like, prior to your paralyzing overwhelm, you saw God in one way, you're performing for him, and then afterwards, pretty different. So how has that paralyzing moment shaped your view of God?
Yeah. So your listeners may come at this from different angles, but there's often something from our backstories that skews our image of who God is. For some, like me, it was growing up in a denomination that didn't really emphasize a relationship with God. And so I had this view of him as this legalistic police officer in the sky who was just waiting for me to make a mistake. And for others, though, it may be people in your life who've harmed you that have made you wonder where God was, or if he cares, or if he's like that. And in that overwhelmed season, I think that's the thing that we're really reaching for when we're really overwhelmed is, do you see me? Do you care? Are you going to do anything? And when we're brave enough to ask those questions, he's not scared. He's not threatened by any of those things, that he reveals more to us of where we have believed a lie and where the truth can be found. And so, in this process of, getting divorced, I was really looking at the word as a law book of like, okay, God, here's my circumstance. What do you say about it? I only want to do what pleases you. And I was so beautifully met, though. I went looking for laws and I found love. And all I could see in the pages were just his love for broken, hurting, overwhelmed people. And how, in knowing that he is love, knowing what love is supposed to be, the true essence of love, then that we know ourselves as the beloved. We know, when we understand that God is love, that we are loved. And when we have a right understanding of who God is as love, and we rightly understand then what it is to be loved, and we can rightly understand ourselves, so much of that stress and that suffering that we have just been carrying around with us just breaks wide open, and it doesn't have power over us anymore. Sometimes we don't dig through these things because we're afraid of what we're going to find. But if we do that, we recognize the Holy Spirit is leading us in it, and he's going to lead us through it. And there is so much beauty to be found on the other side.
Yeah, and I want to pull out a line you said in your article about overwhelm on your website that really resonated with me about who God is. And you said, he knew I had to first taste hope in the present in order to have the strength to revisit the past. And I think that is so beautiful. Can you expand upon that?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I was brought into this community of people that I would not have picked for myself. And the reason I would have not picked it for myself is this was a small group at a church, and all of the members of this group either had been divorced, remarried, or were single. And when I first stepped into this group, I was like, I don't want to be here. I was like, I don't want to be identified as a single mom. I don't like how this feels. I feel like this group is, and I've told them this, but it feels like the island of misfit toys. Like,
yeah.
But I went to another group after that, and no one was divorced or single. And so, they were so well intended, but they really didn't know specifically how to tend to my specific needs. And so as I returned back to that original group, I was just so met by people who got me, who knew exactly what I needed without me even having to say it, who affirmed me, who just wrapped around me and my kids and just made us feel like we belonged. And this was so needed because I had just moved across the country too when all this had happened. And so here I was in a, completely new environment with barely any, no friends to, friends or family for, hundreds of miles around. And so being with this community, though, it was where I was able to experience the love of God through other safe people and really be able to really was encouraged to start asking these questions, like I mentioned, and so then being held and being safe in the present over a little time gave me the courage to step backwards into my story and to look at those things, or to ask God, what were the things? Sometimes we don't even know. Sometimes the things we think we're overwhelmed by, like we said, it's a thing, but beneath the thing, like you don't always know what was the event or what was the moment, or how did I get here? And being safe, though, and being held in the present, having good experiences with God and his people in the here and now allows us to go back to those places where we felt unloved or unsafe and say, but that's no longer true. So it's safe for me now to come back and to process this, to grieve this, because I'm not going to get stuck here because I already am free.
Yeah. And you're attributing that to God, right? I think that's really important, because you could easily say, well, thank goodness, coincidentally,
Oh,
there's a
no,
group,
I don't believe in coincidences.
I don't either. I don't either. I think it's really important to acknowledge where God's hand is working in your life.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the thing is, though, and this is the thing about like the motherhood season, is there's pieces of this for all of us, single mom or not, that are isolating,
Yeah.
especially when you've got really little ones.
Right.
It's just difficult sometimes to make good friends who get you. And so we might feel like we have a stellar relationship with God, but it's being in community with God's people where we continue that understanding of how he works through each of our lives to bless one another. That just as I was saying, you can delight in all these things that he's placed around you, but you can also delight in the relationships that he's put around you as well. And where, isolation is hard for many of us and finding community can be just so discouraging.
Yes, it's hard.
It's worth the work though, because it is another way that we can see the move of God so tangibly in our lives.
Yes. Love that. So, Michelle, let's talk about the thing beneath the thing.
Yeah.
How did you go about truly understanding what was driving your overwhelm?
So there's two answers to this. One was in study time with the Lord. One was, as I mentioned, where there were times where I would pray and I'd ask God, where was the first time I felt this? Or where was the first time that this feeling, came up for me? And he would show me. I'd have these memories that would pop up. And they were things that I remembered and didn't think anything of. But given the length of time of healing and deepening relationship with God and understanding himself and myself rightly, then I could start to figure out where these particular or what these particular memories were illuminating to me. And, those don't come like every single day. It's a lot of times, as I said before, they'll come in these really desperate moments. But they were things that I really didn't even know what to ask. I just was, asking those really open-ended questions of, will you show me? Will you tell me? But the other thing, as far as the roots of all of our overwhelm that did come from study time and just some things that I was working on through the ministry, was understanding that Adam and Eve ate from a tree, and the tree is called the knowledge of good and evil. And that means because they weren't supposed to eat from it, we weren't supposed to have that. We weren't supposed to have the knowledge of good and evil, or evil rather, all we knew was good. We didn't need the knowledge of good and evil,
Right. Yeah.
And so our experiences with the things that overwhelm us in life are very often rooted in a place where evil has touched our lives, where the fall has become too real at home, And as I said before, that can be things that happen in relationships and somewhere in the middle of your life or earlier on in your life. That can be from childhood. But that this rescue plan that God has put in place for us means that this doesn't have to have power over me. And the fact that Jesus has died and risen and defeated sin and death and evil for all time means we have the power to walk in that victory today. So we don't have to wait for eternity. We don't have to wait to get back to perfection, before we can be free from the shackles of what evil is trying to put upon us. And that is something, though, that it seems like really big and heady, It's really like deep theological stuff. But all it really means, though, is that God knows that it's not supposed to be this way. God didn't make it this way. The things that we're going through that are so hard for us, the things that have been done to us. And then, we've got these coping strategies sometimes that we run to that are not, they're not it,
right.
That he wants us to replace those coping strategies with an awareness of just how good he is and how much he cares for us, that the more we turn into him, the more we'll experience that restoration that Jesus bought for us. And really the whole thing is that in the garden, God created us for shalom. He created us for perfection and well-being and peace and harmony. That's what shalom really means. We translate it to mean peace, but it is so much more. And that is what God is restoring to us in this life and through all of redemption eternity.
Yeah, I love that you said restoration, because it's, the coping strategies that we come up for ourselves. Yeah, they may work for a short time, but it's very likely you're not gonna get to the root of it, right?
No, yeah, and sometimes it's interesting. Those are the things that eventually, though, lead us to God, and that's just how awesome He is. That even when we're doing sin as a coping strategy, or I shouldn't say even, because most coping is sin on some level, even if we think it's benign, because what we're doing is replacing God with something else that's lesser,
Right.
But He's so good to allow those things to let us down and disappoint us that we're like, all right, because a lot of this surrender came at the point where it's like, okay, I don't know how to do this.
Right.
Like,
it's like, fine.
you're going to have to show me because I got nothing else.
Oh, man. I've never heard of that before. The fact that God meets us when we are turning to sin to help ourselves, when we are struggling, especially, that's, wow, I love that perspective.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of that, if you think about the prodigal son, he had his way of how he was going to deal with it, and God, is represented by the father, and the father lets him go. He doesn't say, hey, you're going to ruin your life out there. He allows him to go.
Yeah.
That the son would have this experience and realize its limitations and its shortcomings and its disappointments, and that he would be so compelled to come home where he knew he was going to be safe, where he knew at least there's some possibility I could be received on some level.
Yeah.
And God just, in the representation of the Father, He runs out to grab us, He didn't stand there just like, well, I told you so. He meets us. But He's also the one beckoning. He's the one, there's that longing for Him that's in our hearts where we know, all right, this thing that's letting me down, this is not it. Maybe I could give God a try again, or maybe there is a different way. Like that longing is God Himself placing those, that longing in our hearts. And so he's in it start to finish. He's the one who's allowing us to go, but He's the one who's calling us back. He's the one who's meeting us. He's doing all of this. And I think that's just the thing that we need to know when we're overwhelmed, is that you don't have to like willpower muster it up to figure out how to stop doing what you're doing or how to feel better or get through another day. That collapsing into the Father's arms is the way that He is the one who's going to do all that work for us.
Wow, love it. This is such a beautiful conversation. Michelle, there is more on your podcast, Christian Single Moms, as well as your organization, +oneparents.org. And while it's geared towards single moms, I think there are things that every type of mom can get out of it. So can you tell me a little bit more about what moms can expect to find?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're so right. So I host a show called the Christian Single Moms Podcast. And while it is primarily on topics related specifically to life as a single mom, I have a great bevy of listeners, who are not single moms, but have experienced maybe some kind of difficulty or hardship or trauma that is making their mothering more difficult for them. And so where we're talking about things like the love of God and faith and emotional health and, just all the way that this gets lived out in our relationships, especially those relationships with our kids, that's not something that only single moms need. That's something that all of us need. So that's where you can find me, those on the Christian Single Moms Podcast. And then over on Facebook or Instagram at +one.parents or at +oneparents.org.
Amazing. Thank you so much for all your wisdom today, Michelle. This has been awesome.
It has been so fun, Hannah. Thanks for having me.
All right, friend, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Michelle Donnelly, and it gives you some tips and strategies to get out of your really overwhelming, paralyzing moments. If you'd like to learn more from Michelle, check out her podcast, the Christian Single Moms Podcast, as well as her organization, +oneparents.org. I'll have links to all of those in the show notes, as well as momsgrabcoffee.com/33. Also, make sure you're subscribed to the show because on the next episode, I am going to have Monica Norcross on the show, and she is going to walk us through a demonstration of releasing anxiety through her fitness method called the Still Workout. So that's going to be super fun. I don't want you to miss it. All right, friend, that's all I have for today. I'll catch you again next time for a cup of coffee, a little still workout with a side of faith, wisdom, and hope.